Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Let's take some letters from listeners. Kathy writes in on the 2024 presidential debate that Republicans had last week. She said, I've been interested in Mike Pence because of his experience and his demonstration of quality statesmanship. But she says that he reminded me of the criticism laid against Jimmy Carter, self-righteous and arrogant. Do you think Mike Pence will have the same potential problem of distancing himself from Washington and being critical of the American public if elected president? And Bill, I will throw that one to you as someone who remembers the days of Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, if he's elected president, I don't think there'll be a problem. I think the problem is being elected. There are some that don't like his references to religion stuff. I think his bigger problem is that the anti-Trump people really don't like him because he faithfully served Donald Trump. And the Donald Trump people don't like him because he didn't do what Trump wanted on January 6th and instead followed the Constitution. So I think he's unique in this race for that reason. A lot of people start out disliking him kind of from opposite sides.
Brian writes in and cites the Yogi Berra line, nobody goes there anymore, it's too crowded, and says he's reminded of that when I hear that supposedly almost no one wants a Biden-Trump rematch, but both of them maintain apparently unassailable leads. And he asks whether we have any further insight into how the American electorate can be held hostage in this way, as he puts it. And the thing to look at there, Kim, to my mind, is the share of people that are voting in these primaries that choose the nominees for the two major parties. If you go back and look at Iowa in November of 2016, 2.4 million adults in the state. In November of 2016, they cast 1.6 million votes. But the number of people who were actually counted in the Iowa caucus that year was only 187,000. You can go look at another state. Nevada's 2016 Republican caucus drew 75,000 votes compared with 1.1 million Nevadans who voted in the general election that year. Arizona's Republican primary in 2016 got about 625,000 votes compared to about 2.6 million in November. So, Kim, that is part of the answer to my mind, is that only about 50 to 60% of Americans vote in presidential contests in the first place. And then the share who are voting in these primaries and caucuses is a fraction of that fraction. So when you see the Republican and the Democratic primary polls, the pollsters are generally selecting for people who say that they are likely to vote in those primaries.
Yeah, and there are groups out there, and you wrote a great piece about this, Kyle, like Americans for Prosperity, that they are concerned about a potential Donald Trump renomination. And one of their ambitions is to pull more people into that primary process. I think there's a couple of issues, though, with this. I totally agree that it would be wonderful if we had more Americans who were taking part in the primary process, and obviously wonderful if there were more people who were voting in the general election. The right to vote is this amazing, wonderful thing that so many other people in the world don't have, and unfortunately, we don't always take it as seriously as we ought to. One issue is states are going to have to reevaluate, or at least some states, the rules governing who can take part in primaries, as we've increasingly seen a huge number of Americans disassociate themselves with either the Republican or the Democratic Party and declare themselves independents. It's a state-by-state process, but that does make it harder for some of them to take part in a primary process because of the letter that comes after their name. I'm not quite sure, even if you did get like 10 or 15% more in a primary situation, that necessarily stops Donald Trump if you've still got four people splitting the vote against him at the end of the day. I think the Republicans are going to help themselves far more if they have a winnowing process in which this becomes a head-to-head match in the end. Now, where I do think that increase in number of voters could really help us in a general election, especially because we've had so many 50-50 elections recently, and because that may be all the more interesting and important if you end up having some third-party candidates on the ballot this year, whether that be a Joe Manchin under a no labels campaign, or whether that be a losing Donald Trump in the primary who decides to run an independent bid on his own.
Let's take one more. Tom says, you keep talking about how lower tariffs would be good for U.S. consumers because tariffs are like taxes. I don't see why a 10% tariff on imported goods would have the same impact as a much smaller national sales tax. Sales taxes are more economically efficient than income taxes, and he brings up the fair tax proposal to replace the U.S. income tax with a national sales tax. I guess, Bill, to my mind, the question with the fair tax proposal is always whether you trust the politicians in Washington to keep that deal, or whether you will end up with a sales tax and an income tax. And by the way, that is part of the issue with these tariffs, is President Trump put tariffs on all sorts of goods that people buy, that go into the products that people buy. And I don't know about you, but I did not see a rebate on that anywhere in my income taxes.
Yeah, I don't think Donald Trump called for a reduction in taxes to offset his proposed import tax. That's a lot of money, 5% to put on imports, or 10%, whatever it is. We've already lost 6% due to inflation. And I think this would have a devastating effect. I would have to see. I think there's some logic to replacing income with sales taxes, but I would like to see something that made clear you get rid of the income tax first, and then you have the sales tax, because anything else is just going to be more taxes rather than fewer.
Kim, we'll give you the last word. I agree with Bill, but the problem of getting rid of the income tax is it takes a constitutional amendment to repeal the other constitutional amendment, and that is a hard thing to try to do while you're trying to impose a national sales tax at the same time. The last point I would make on these tariffs, I would point to an analysis by the economists at the Tax Foundation. Says former President Donald Trump's proposed 10% tariff would raise taxes on American consumers by more than $300 billion a year, a tax increase rivaling the ones proposed by President Biden. And my recollection is the same as Bill's here, that I do not recall President Trump calling for some sort of compensating tax cuts elsewhere.
As long as I've been alive, people have talked about how a national consumption tax, a national sales tax would make so much more economic and efficiency sense. Totally agree. But here's two certainties. One, getting rid of the income tax is almost impossible. And two, if you bring along a national sales tax, you will get it and an income tax, and then those taxes will both grow, and they'll grow even bigger. And you could even argue that one of the problems with the national sales tax is it's so easy to convince lawmakers to tweak it higher here or there because there are different categories of goods you can put it on, et cetera. It's a much more pernicious tax in that regard. One other last thing I'd say too about tariffs is all of this is important in terms of people's individual incomes, but I would note that the other consequence of tariffs is that they're almost always retaliatory. So when we put them on another country, they slap them back on us, and that gives us some terrible penalties on our own manufacturers and farmers and those that are trying to send goods to other countries. So it hits us in another direction too.
Thank you, Kim and Bill. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.